Hello, and welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, the Irish Daily Star's crime podcast. I'm crime correspondent Michael O'Toole. Today, I'm delighted to say we've been joined by our chief sports reporter, Kieran Cunningham. Hello, Kieran.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
I'm great. Now, Kieran, we've invited you on today for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you've got a new pod coming out in the coming days, and I believe it's about Katie Taylor.
Yeah, it's called Untouchable. So the first episode drops tomorrow, Tuesday, and it'll be one each day till Friday. It's in the build-up to her fight against Chantal Cameron in the 3 Arena in Dublin on Saturday, which is a big homecoming fight, her first fight as a professional, her first fight in Ireland at all since 2016. So it's been quite a while. It's the second go at a podcast. Like I did a podcast last year, a series, Shadow Boxing, looking at Daniel Kinahan's infiltration of the sport. And that can be a bit of an appetite to try and get into, the more meaty stories, something that might have a wider appeal outside Ireland too. And she is an international figure. So we'll see how it goes. I think we're quite happy with what we've got.
And yes, and Shadowboxing was really an excellent pod. You picked Katie Taylor because she's such a big character in her own right. Would that be the case?
There's a number of reasons. One of the main reasons is I've interviewed her a huge amount of times over the years, and often she doesn't give a lot away. And her whole story about how the barrier she faced, just to get into the ring. It was so hard for girls as she was at the time to be allowed to box in Ireland. But one of the things that struck me was, I've interviewed her a lot, so you're always trying to think of some fresh angle. Because when you interview somebody a lot, it can be difficult at times. And one of those was, I've seen it a lot of, she's a kind of feminist icon because she is in the most male sports. But she's a woman at the really top of the tree within that male sport, and one of the only women who's ever made a serious impact in it. So I just asked her a very short question, are you a feminist? But she said she wasn't. So that sparked something in me to look into that, So it kind of framed the first episode as looking at the position, at a wider sense of women in Ireland, which was very difficult for most of the 20th century, and then focusing on the difficulties for women in sport, and specifically in sport in Ireland. And that's a very interesting story in itself. There was huge opposition. No Irish woman went to the Olympics in 1956 with Maeve Kyle. Now, she talked about the abuse she got. There were letters to the Irish Times calling her a disgrace to Irish motherhood for going to the Olympics. The main opponent that stopped a woman going to the Olympics for 20 years was Archbishop John Charles McQueen.
Why did I think you were going to say that?
Yeah, well, why would that surprise people? And I talked to, because it made me think that, about this is kind of in ways the biggest boxing event here since Muhammad Ali came to Ireland, in terms of just how big a figure she is in the world. And it just made me think of that Ireland in 1972, the marriage bar was in place. So women in the public service, like teachers, Gardaí, civil servants, whatever. Well, I think actually Gardaí, they weren't vanguard at the time, was in 72. But you had to leave the service once you got married. And 1972 was also the year the Irish women's movement started. So one of the people I talked to was Rosita Sweetman, who was one of the founders of that. And she told me a story about McQuaid I didn't know. He wanted to ban the pommel horse in gymnastics because he thought young girls and women could use it to try and get sexual stimulation. So that's the kind of stuff women in sport had to deal with in Ireland. So that was kind of the starting point. I went into different angles then for different episodes, but from episode 1, I kind of hooked it from there. So,
and I'm interested. Why did she offer any explanation as to why she didn't consider herself a feminist?
No, she doesn't really expect. I have the quote is in the podcast, but she gave a couple of lines. I don't really think of myself that way. And then she just said, I'm here just to represent women or try and build a legacy or something. I'm not sure the exact words, but I think because I teased this out a bit with Rosita, with Deirdre Nelson, who's a former boxer who was from Antrim, who's a very important figure in the history of women's boxing here, because she took a sex discrimination case to the Boxing Union of Ireland and won that case, which allowed women to box here. And she's she would definitely consider herself a feminist. I've talked to her about that, and I talked to her, Emer Ryan, who's an Irish writer, who's just brought out a really good book called The Grass Ceiling. She was a camogie player for Tipperary, and it's about being a woman in sport. And they kind of teased that out a bit. And one of the things a few people say is there are women who are a bit very wary of that as a label. This feel that it's stigmatized in some way. Now, I don't think it is. Like, I think Katie Taylor is the epitome of feminism, because feminism is all about equality, and celebrating equality, and to do what she's done in such a male environment. Like, it's really hard to think of a more male environment than boxing. I think I can see why she's a feminist icon to many.
And did your view, when you were making the program, did your view change, as in, do you think it is easier for women to be involved in sport nowadays? Because I'm thinking of those controversies about the changing rooms and all. Wasn't it in the ladies' soccer team? Even that's quite recent. So, is there a groundswell of support for women in sport, or are there still barriers, would you think?
There's still barriers, but the situation has definitely improved. You only have to look at the media. Like, if you look at now, the coverage across the board, like all the games of the Irish women's soccer and rugby teams are televised live. The amount of camogie and women's GA games that are televised, the amount of coverage female individual athletes get, and a lot of, you look at the last couple of Olympics, a lot of the major stars here now are female in sport. And, even somebody like Rachel Blackmore, who's in an unusual position because she's a woman competing against men. But she's the first female jockey to win the Grand National, first female jockey to be leading a jockey at Cheltenham, winning the biggest races at Cheltenham. So in many ways, Ireland has been quite groundbreaking in terms of women's sport. There are ways to go. What happened with the FAI, you have to look at the FAI at that time as well. It was absolute carnage, chaos, whatever word you want to use. And we know the reasons why. So it wasn't just women who suffered at that time in the FAI.
But is it fair to say that women's sport is getting much more professional, and there's a much more professional ethos around all aspects of women's elite sport anyway?
Yeah. With some sports, it's very hard to take a broad view of sport, or to lump them all in together. Like, if you say, like, somebody like Sonia O'Sullivan, say, in the past, would have been an elite level athlete and probably the greatest sports person out of Ireland for quite a long period. And she would have been operating a sport that was very, very professional. But, if you say women's boxing, like, even when Katie Taylor was an amateur, she was still earning more than some professional world champions. So women's boxing has come on in leaps and bounds. Like, even though she turned professional in 2016, it's far more competitive now than it was in 2016. There's still a road to travel, but it's a relatively new sport. And you see that across the board. Like, you see with the Ireland women's rugby team, like, rugby at the men's game has been professional since 1995. Only really half the Irish team, rugby team, are professional. Across the board, teams have only been professional for a few years. So you can never compare like with like. Like, I think a lot of people make the mistake of comparing sports to male sport. Like, if they watch, I watched the women's soccer Euros last year, and I enjoyed a lot of the games. But you do see some of the reactions on social media. So people saying, "Oh, this is, the standard is good." They're comparing it to men who've been playing at a high level professionally for over 100 years, so it is good. You just have to watch it for what it is and not be comparing it to, there's no Lionel Messi here, that, which is a ridiculous way of looking at it.
And tell me, I'll be a distant observer. I always had a thing for boxing when I was growing up, Barry McGuigan, and I'd be that generation. So I would have an interest. But Katie Taylor always strikes me when I watch her on TV as someone who's quite guarded. Do you think that is the case?
Yeah, she's very guarded. Like, I wouldn't say that many people outside her family know her really well. Like, if you look at her background, it's her father's from Sheffield in England, so there's that side of her family, and her mother is from Ireland. She grew up in a working class estate in Bray, but like and her family are very different in what they've done. Like one brother would be, working in the trades. I'm not sure what. But I think it was an electrician. But another brother is an academic in Trinity. So, they all go. It's like you see that with a lot of Irish families. That people can, like I see my own family, people do all sorts of things. It doesn't really. It's not rooted as much in your background as it used to be. But also, she's an evangelical Christian. So I've kind of framed this at the start about the influence Catholic Ireland had on women, but she's not part of Catholic Ireland as well. Like she has that removed. She's half English. Or half of her family are English, and she's from a Protestant tradition of evangelical Christianity. She's a very private figure in a sport that kind of forces you to be very public. Like it's all about selling yourself and trash talking and talking yourself up, and it doesn't sit well with her, But there's things, and I mentioned this in the podcast, but you look at the time when she went professional, like just before Christmas of 2015. Like herself and her father Pete were very close. He was her trainer for many years, and he got involved in another relationship and he left Bridget. And that caused a huge rift within the family. And this was 6-7 months out from the Olympics. So that caused huge disruption. Before the Olympics, she lost the Olympic qualifiers, she lost in the World Championships, and then she lost in Rio itself. So she had 3 defeats in a short space of time. And I remember how stunned she was in Rio. Like I was at Rio at her fight, and like she was just, she didn't, her world was falling apart. And very quickly she went professional. Very quickly, she moved to Connecticut in America, this small town called Vernon. It was the kind of place you'd see in a David Lynch film, like Blue Velvet or something, those white picket fences. And it's very much very quiet middle America. And it's very isolated. And she went there and she knew nobody. I know when the winter's there, it'd be 20 below, it would be snow everywhere. She's out running on her own. The first 6 months she was there, she had no TV. She had no laptop. She used to sit, when she wasn't training or at church, she would watch Netflix on her phone. So, there is that drive in her, and what I described as the lonely passion of Katie Taylor, what's the Brian Moore novel reference to it, The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn. But she is, she's a remarkably interesting character, but I do sometimes wonder what will happen to her after boxing. She's 37 next month. You can't go on forever. She could get beaten this Saturday. She's up against a serious opponent. And, at once, a lot of athletes struggle with life, the afterlife, as they call it. And she has been so driven by her ambitions within boxing from a very young age that, I hope she can find something else after it.
And how do you think the fight will go? You said there is a possibility she could get beaten. It's going to be a tough fight for her, is it?
Yeah, well, she said she had a mandatory defense at the end of last year, and it's one of those that she was always going to win, and she hit no great heights. But her best performance was probably against Amanda Serrano in Madison Square Garden in New York last year, just over a year ago. And she was amazing that night. But, that by the time Saturday comes around, that will be 13 months on. As I say, she'll be nearly 37. And she's also stepping up in weight, which is always a great unknown in boxing, because that means effectively you are going to go in against somebody who's more power than you, because you've been used to, like Katie Taylor's a lot of attributes, but she wouldn't have a huge amount of power. Like you look at the amount of knockouts on her record, it's quite low. She hasn't had a knockout in a few years now. So more than likely it will go the distance. If anyone is to get a knockout, it would be Cameron. But I had this conversation with, I better not name them, but somebody close who would know the scene very well. And they said the hometown, I was just saying to him, because this is billed as such a big event. It's Katie Taylor's homecoming. She is such a big figure within the sport. She's fighting in Ireland for the first time as a professional. And boxing is based on judges scorecards, and how can they be swayed? Like there's plenty of evidence that indicates they can be swayed by factors like a hometown crowd, the reputation that somebody has. So I was just saying to this person, well, what would that be worth? Is that worth a round? Because you're judged in each round of 10 rounds. So would that give you 1 round? Would it give you 2 rounds? And he said, hometown fighters, the stats are 61% of the win. So to me, if it's tight, Katie Taylor will win. She'll get the verdict. But no, at the same time, Cameron is capable of winning by the 2 or 3 rounds margin that I think she would need, because I think a tight decision, judges will favour the hometown fighter, especially if it's somebody the stature of Katie Taylor. So really, I don't know. You don't know that night because, what do you base it? We don't know where Katie Taylor is. There's no guarantee she is at the level she was at when she fought Serrano, because with boxing and with any sport, like there's one day it's no longer there. Like you'll see it with Manchester City in 10 or 20 years, maybe, but there could be some day it's no longer there.
I was only talking to somebody about a crime reporter talking about Man City. It's never a good thing. But I was only talking about this today. You know what? When Pep goes, I think people will realise, because I would say it's like Klopp. I think Pep gets us maybe 10 or 12 points a year. I think like Klopp as well. And I think when he goes, people will realise how important he was, because everybody's talking about all the Galacticos and we have, but I think a massive factor is Klopp. So you're quite right. It is. He is a factor.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because the equivalent of a football manager is a boxing trainer, and Ross Enamite, Katie Taylor's trainer, is brilliant at getting her. Like the condition she's in for every fight is amazing. But I actually think she still misses Pete a bit. I think Pete was smarter in controlling Katie's worst urges, and what I mean by that is, Katie Taylor has this pride that a lot of boxers have, that technically she's miles ahead of everyone, including Cameron, including Serrano. Like if she just boxes clever and does the technical things right that she's well capable of doing, stays out of trouble, she'd win every fight comfortably, I think. But when fighters make it a scrap, which I think Cameron will try to do as well, she can't resist being involved. She thinks, like, who the hell are you? If you want to scrap, I'll do it. And so far, she's been able to do that as well. But I think that is, I think Pete would have to would be able to rein her back a little bit and say, hold on. With a scrap, you could be just caught cold with one punch. You're just a dangerous game. Just get through the rounds, round by round. They're only 2 minutes long. Get through it, do the smart thing, and you'll win.
God, Kieran, you've got me excited. I must say, I'm really looking forward to myself. Tell me, would you agree that Katie Taylor and Kelly Harrington, I know there was a bit of a controversy about her a few weeks ago, but largely they are 2 massive PR successes for boxing in Ireland?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the bigger picture, as you say with Kelly, she took a bit of battering a few weeks ago, but overall, there's a huge amount of good feeling towards them. And one of the things that you see that is every year there's a survey that comes out where a PR company polls people and asks who's the most admired sports person in Ireland. And Kelly Harrington's done quite well the last couple of years, but year after year, Katie Taylor wins that poll and wins it by a mile. And I've always found that interesting, because a lot of the people who say that will never have seen her fight in the flesh. And also, even to watch her on TV, like she's not even on Sky Sports or BT Sports. She's on DAZN now, which is an app, and then you cast to your TV, or you have it on your TV as an app even. But she has that aura. I think people admire something in her. And they have been, like, it's obviously the sports image in Ireland has taken a massive battering over the last 10 years. But they are the two probably the brightest lights of it, that's been good for it.
Well, and you bring me on to my next question, Kieran, and crime reporters don't do happy, so we've got that out of the way. But you're quite right. Boxing, and it's the reason why I'm talking to you today, boxing has taken a battering the last 10 years in Ireland. And I would contend that is largely to do with a man called Daniel Kinahan.
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone will argue with you on that. There was an interesting article in the Sunday Times yesterday by Michael Foley, as around the Katie Taylor fight. And he touched on the Kinahan stuff in the build-up, which was good to see, because I think it's important. You can't ignore it this week, because, even the 3 Arena is North Inner City, where a lot of the carnage within that feud took place. It's only a couple of miles away from the Regency Hotel itself, and there are key figures involved on the night who are very much involved with Daniel Kinahan. So for those reasons, I think this story it should be part of the build-up this week. But one of the things Michael talked to a guy, Leonard Gunning, because you will hear some people say this week, this is the first time pro boxing has been back in Dublin since the Regency. That's not true. There's been about 15 or 16 bills since the Regency, but they've all been very small scale, really, what they call small hall shows. And but one of the guys who promoted a lot of those shows, a chap called Leonard Gunning, and I could fully talk to him. And he talked about the cost of insurance. To put on a fight in Dublin is 20 times the cost in insurance terms to Belfast, which is a real boxing town, as you know. And a large part of that, I think, will be down to the Regency and Daniel Kinahan. But, insurance costs at the south of the border, there's an issue with them anyway. And also everything in Dublin seems to be ludicrously expensive. But just before I finish that point, he said when they went outside Dublin, Leonard Gunning, when they went to venues, say, in Waterford or Sligo or Cork, different people approached them and say, but not boxing. There was just this, he said you could see in their eyes. They said, no, God, we're not touching boxing. They were wary of it. And it's had an impact on potential sponsors, potential venues. It's been broadcasters and different media. Like I know, even within the newspaper industry, a lot of people within the sport that, like say the Sunday Independent yesterday, they didn't have one word on this. That's the day you would normally be previewing, a Katie Taylor fight if it's a Saturday. And particularly such a big deal of a fight, and the other Sundays give it quite a lot of coverage, but they stayed away from it. And some media just have been turned off boxing completely because of the links to Kinahan.
So tell me, the reason why we're talking to you about this today is one of the episodes that you have about the Katie Taylor fight is about let's call it the Kinahan effect.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it has been a decade, how much damage do you think Daniel Kinahan did to Irish boxing?
I think I don't know how you measure it, but he did it serious damage. He we'll only really know that I think in 10 or 20 years' time. To see what the post Katie Taylor world is like. Would there anyone have a hope of filling the 3 Arena in the future? Is it? Is there even though Dublin is a strong boxing city in some ways, like if you look at the champions, Olympic and professional that come out of the place, you look in the North Inner City, there's a road called Champions Avenue that's so called because so many boxing champions came from that area. You look at the amount of boxing clubs that are in Dublin, the amount that are involved in sports, but boxing has often been a hard sell here. Like even when big name fighters like Lennox Lewis and Nassim Hamid fought here, there weren't great crowds. Tickets were hard to sell, and the last time there was a full house at a venue of the scale of the 3 Arena was in the Old Point Depot when Bernard Dunn became world champion. That was 2009. It's 14 years ago now. So. There's a generation really, that would have been in their early teens then or mid-teens, and they're touching 30 now. And, they've never been to big time pro boxing. Will they ever go to it? If they don't go this week, will they ever go to it in Dublin? So because I think it's got an uncertain future, definitely.
And that's a valid point because, as we know, Daniel Kinahan, I know he'd been a fan of boxing and had been involved in it, but it was only in 2012, really, that he set up MTK, which would later become MGM. And we know that he's alleged, we know his storied background with MGM and the whole MTK story. So in 2009, that's 3 years before MTK was set up. So do you think it was in general decline before Kinahan got involved?
Well, see, it's important to state as well, it's not just an Irish problem. Like part of the problem was, if you look at the 1990s, say, do you remember ITV used to pro boxing bill on every Saturday night? And they used to get great numbers, sometimes up to 15 million, like generally between 10 and 15 million, depending who was on. And the likes of Steve Collins and Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank, etc., they became household names. But boxing went down a route where it went to pay-per-view. It went to pay channels like Sky, and then even if you had a Sky subscription, often it was pay-per-view for the actual fight itself. So there's an extra charge on top of that. Now, that was very good in one way, and that boxers made more money. Some boxers made a lot more money, and other people within the sport, particularly promoters and managers, made a lot more money. But it lost an audience. Like, it became more invisible and more marginalized. And that, you find that cricket went down that route too, and a lot of people talk about that within cricket, that it was a big mistake, that it's shrunk their audience, and it did shrink the boxing audience too. So if you look at why was Bernard Dunn, Pat? Like, RTE got behind Bernard Dunn, so his fights were on terrestrial TV, and that makes a massive difference, because to get people in, you have to be visible. But if you're not visible, it's a hard sell.
So we know that in April last year, so 13 months ago, the Gardaí and the Americans issued this wanted case against Daniel Kinahan, his father Christy, and his brother Christopher, and they accused them of being, drug barons and heading a €1 billion cartel. And there's been evidence in Spanish courts and Irish courts about these men. But before that, there were significant efforts. I would contend there were probably 3 different sort of attacks by pro-Kinahan supporters in boxing, trying to rehabilitate him, and that dreaded word, sports wash him. For me, there were probably 3 concerted efforts, say from maybe 2017 to 2022. It's clear to me that Kinahan wanted to become the Mr. Fix-It of boxing. The man who organizes everything. And we know that, Tyson Fury, when he agreed the fight with Anthony Joshua, he announced it, and he thanked Daniel Kinahan, as he called him. So there were significant efforts underway to make him the legitimate face of boxing worldwide. And I think it very nearly succeeded. And I only think it was the launching of the sanctions that killed it, because there had been a huge head of steam, maybe 6 months to a year before that. How close do you think he came to becoming, boxing's Mr. Fix-It?
Well, he was at the pinnacle of the sport. That's he achieved he was a major power broker in a lot of big fights, and I think that was his goal. I think there definitely was a concerted campaign. There's so many things to go through here on this. Now, one of them is, that was April last year, as you say. Mick, what has happened in pro boxing since then? One of the issues with pro boxing was the lack of governance within it that allowed somebody like Daniel Kinahan to become involved and to rise so high and so far. And nobody has tried to address that since. Nobody has said, okay, we need to put something in place here to stop this ever happening again. Has anybody in boxing spoken out in the last 13 months saying, how the hell did this happen? This has been terrible for the sport. We should never have allowed somebody like Daniel Kinahan to become so powerful. There hasn't. It's been complete. Can you use omerta? That's a word somebody else used. A word somebody else had used.
Bob Arum spoke out, but I don't think he was doing it through the goodness of his heart.
No. There's Bob Arum has a famous quote. I was lying yesterday, but today I'm telling the truth. So from that, you always take what Bob as to say, with a large pinch of salt, or the thinking that he might have different reasons for saying something. And
just, you can explain this better than me, but he would have been associated with Kinahan in the run-up to the sanctions. And once the sanctions came on, it was like a light being switched off or on. He completely turned on him and started bad-mouthing him, effectively saying what a bad guy he was. But beforehand, he'd said he was brilliant.
Yeah. Well, there's something to say there, actually. Eddie Hearn, the head of Matchroom. Now, Eddie Hearn is behind, he is both Katie Taylor and Chantel Cameron this weekend are Matchroom Priders, so he's a key figure within the sport. And he's like a few in boxing that he says some stuff that, come on, Eddie, I just don't believe that. But he did say something a couple of years ago, and he was bang on. He said it's hard to be involved at a high level in this sport and not have dealt with Daniel Kinahan. And I actually agree with him on that. I don't think he's, like some might have said, he's just trying to cover his own back. But I think there were very few people at a high level within boxing And I would bring broadcasters into that. Like, broadcasters should not be let off the hook because they bankroll the sport to a large extent. But promoters, managers, broadcasters, etc., virtually, or the vast majority of them, did deal with Daniel Kinahan. And the information I have from talking to people, particularly in the UK in the last couple of months, is there are some people still dealing with him, and that he still has him involved in boxing. Now, I did make the assumption, and maybe you did as well, Mick, that when the US sanctions hit, that he would just step away, that this was too tricky, and that I thought maybe just for his ego, he wanted his name out there. But it seems that even though his name can't be out there, that he does, there are bills and there are certain promotion and management companies that his fingerprints are all over.
So, and now this is really interesting. This is something that I want to explore. So, say from, I don't know, maybe 2012 when he set up MTK to 2017, really, he had a sort of hidden hand in boxing. He was sort of guiding things without promoting himself. But then 2018 to 2022, I don't know, was it his ego? He sort of went public and he had this campaign, as we've spoken about, to make him really, really relevant. So do you think, and what would your sources tell you, believe this, that he's now gone back into a sort of a hidden hand again, that he's trying to control things and influence things in the background?
Yeah, that's yes is the short answer. He's kind of reverted to where his position of a few years ago, that he has a significant involvement, but it's not as public involvement as he had a couple of years ago when people were name checking him all the time. It's like one of the things I've thought long and hard about, Mick, is how do you deal with the legacy of Daniel Kinahan in boxing and MTK, in that so many people, like if you put it this way, because boxing is a small world, and you're never that, with most people who have any kind of degree of success, they either dealt with Daniel Kinahan or they're one step away from somebody who dealt with Daniel Kinahan. So you have like I interview Andy Lee for this Kenny Taylor podcast. And Andy Lee, he's a cousin to Tyson Fury, and Tyson Fury is tied to MTK Global, and he trained Tyson Fury for some of his fights. But I've thought about this, and I think I was wondering about this. Do you condemn everybody or dismiss everybody or challenge everybody to talk about Daniel Kinahan, who dealt with him or was in any way involved in MTK? And I just think that's a bit too broad. But I do think that people who, in effect, did try and sports wash his name in public, and I would have Tyson Fury in that, because he talked him up so much. Sonny Edwards, Sam Jones, they talked them up publicly. And that's one of the reasons, I asked Jamie Moore, is training Chantel Cameron, and he was shot in the case of mistaken identity outside Daniel Kinahan's villa in Marbella. And that you said, we talked about this before, that you can argue that that's where the Kinahan Hutch feud started, with that shooting. I know Jamie Moore has no connection with criminality, but he did in an interview with The Guardian, he described Daniel Kinahan as a great bloke. He had social media posts where he attacked the media for what was written about Daniel Kinahan, and as we know, what was written was the truth. So I think somebody like that, like when he was in Dublin a few weeks ago for a press conference, I asked Jamie Moore about this and whether he regretted the support for Daniel Kinahan. So I do think that people who kind of contribute to kind of legitimizing Daniel Kinahan as a force in boxing, like what they said in public or wrote on social media, whatever, I think it's legitimate to challenge them now.
Just thinking back to Bob Arum, he effectively said that Kinahan threatened him at one stage. Do you get any sense that people in boxing were or are afraid of Daniel Kinahan? And that's one of the reasons why you can't get rid of him.
Without doubt. I know that from doing the Shadow Boxing podcast and from doing other pieces about on this story since then, that getting anybody within boxing to talk about him on the record, you get a few to talk on the record. It's been very difficult. Like, I've got a few over the years, but there's a long list of no's, and it just comes up as it's a small world. It is such a small world that everybody knows everybody else, and sometimes you don't realize the connections until somebody else says you, well, that guy it's actually related to him, who was a member of the cartel or whatever, that people just think it's not worth the hassle. They probably think, no, they probably think they'd be safe enough, but they think, why the hell would they take the risk? And I can understand that, in fairness, I do understand that. So.
And our producer Kieran Bradley kindly sent me the episode in which you discussed the Kinahan effect within boxing, and I was really struck by what you said about Kinahan is now effectively back in the background. Do you think he plays a major role in boxing now, from the shadows?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things on the horizon in boxing, and the information I have is that he's involved. I can't, for obvious reasons, I can't name them because we have to be careful about what we say. But no, these would be major events, so that makes me think he still holds significant power. Yeah,
and it's fair to say, without naming them, there'd be multi-million euro, dollar events.
Yeah, there would.
So big ticket events.
Big money. Yeah. He's still very well connected. Yeah, definitely.
So, as well as yourself in the pod, there's a legendary boxing journalist, Donald McRae.
Mm.
And he says the same thing as you. He has heard and would be of the belief that Kinahan is back. Or did he ever go away? I don't know. But that Kinahan still maintains a massive, let's use the word, influence on boxing around the world.
Yeah, Don says the same. Yeah. And as you said, to me, Don is the most respected writer within the sport, and he's been good on this story. He's been solid, and he's asked hard questions, and he would have a lot of good sources. And when people listen to the pod, they'll hear what Don has to say, and he's pretty convinced that Daniel Kinahan is involved in professional boxing still. Yeah.
Can you see him trying to make, despite the sanctions, trying to make another effort to become public and become accepted within the mainstream boxing?
I think actually you're probably better qualified to answer that, because you would have more knowledge about how close the US authorities are to getting their hands on it. But I think it would be tricky because. When you even look at the no-fly list, so many people, and some of them with a very loose connection to Daniel Kinahan, weren't allowed to enter the US, So I think...
That happened to Tyson Fury. He was...
Yeah, and I think his brother Tommy, and, basically because he was Tyson's brother. So it was a very broad list.
I personally think he's got a very, very, very small chance of rehabilitating himself within boxing because those sanctions are hanging over him. I think it's more likely that he will be charged somewhere. My own view is probably going to be America. So, I'm not going to say never, but I think he's got a very small chance of doing this.
I agree.
Why do you think he's involved? Is it ego or is it money? Or is it both?
I think it's both. Yeah. It's... a lot of stuff has come out since the sanctions, across the media about where the Kinahans had money invested, they laundered money through all sorts of avenues, through investments in shopping centers, cryptocurrencies, everything, and I would be pretty confident that boxing was seen as another means to do so. So I think that was part of it. I do think it's his ego. I think he did, I think he liked, somebody of the stature, Tyson Fury, name checking him. He liked people saying he was the best thing to ever happen to boxing. I do think, even that decision, which I think was a very ill-fated one now, to do a podcast with James English that never saw the light of day. But I think, the little clip of a preview there that was released as a promo, where he talked about being in the Regency and, described somebody reaching for a gun. I think that's, it doesn't surprise me that was pulled. He's admitting basically he's a witness to what happened then, so he put himself in tricky territory there, I think. So, yeah, I think ego, ambition, and money. I mentioned the last podcast, I was in an apartment in a different country years ago doing an interview, and the guy who was interviewing, I was asking him, how did you end up in this apartment? And he was somebody I knew. I didn't realize any connection in any way to Kinahan. So he said, "Oh, Daniel Kinahan owns it," and it wasn't a part of the world you would think Daniel Kinahan could have any involvement. But it just shows the strands were everywhere.
Let me ask Kieran, you would obviously speak to a lot of people off the record in the boxing business here and abroad. What's the view of Kinahan? I mean, is it like, oh, this fella's a pain in the neck, or are some people, do you think, genuinely still fond of him or support him no matter what?
I think Daniel Kinahan's rise and his popularity with some people is an indictment of the way professional boxing is. That basically, for generations, a lot of boxers are screwed, have been screwed by fighters and by managers and promoters. And he, with a fair few of them, he did pay them well, and he paid them on time, crucially, and he gave them, they were able to train and stay in good facilities. So that's, that bought him affection, because it is a brutal sport. It's a sport where you literally put your life on the line every time you go into the ring. The dangers for ex-fighters, so many of them are left with permanent brain injuries, with pugilistic dementia. They're left damaged in all sorts of ways after they hang up their gloves. So you're only doing that sport and at the professional level to make money. It's not like at amateur level. It can be, you're doing it because you love the love of the techniques and the skills and the challenges of it. And that's part of the professional game. But it's so dangerous that ultimately it is about money, and it's about trying to get a future for yourself and your family that mightn't be there otherwise. Generally boxers are from very deprived backgrounds.
And I think, it is fair to say, I could understand how somebody who is from a deprived background and Daniel Kinahan takes them under his wing and starts to look after them. I could understand where they would go, I'm not interested in what the media say or whatever. I'm going to base my judgment on Daniel Kinahan in the direct interactions I've had with him, and he's always been good to me. I can understand why people might say that.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Like a few weeks ago, both of us were part of a documentary that RT Primetime made around the Hutch, Jerry Hutch, following his acquittal for the Regency. And I thought that was a very fair documentary in the way it portrayed the Dublin that he grew up in and how neglected and deprived it was. And you could see how people from that background don't trust the state or the Gardaí or, the people that they see, or politicians, or the people that are in positions of power, because basically they've never got anything from them. Like they were left to rot for generations. So I could, with so many marginalized communities, that's the case, even now, in different parts of the world. So they saw somebody like Daniel Kinahan to, as far as they could see it, he was treating them fairly, and that's all that mattered. The official world was saying something otherwise, but that official world had never done anything for them, so they didn't care.
I just want to go back to you were talking about the media boycott that MTK had and all that sort of stuff. Now, I can give you a crime reporter's perspective. I was fascinated by the campaign, the pro Kinahan campaign, and it really was something. Because I was wondering how much money have these geezers spent in this, because there were there were many docudramas or whatever. There was no mess in there. It was a real big thing. But how did it feel as a sports reporter who covers boxing, watching? I was watching it from a criminal perspective. You're watching it from a sports perspective. How did it feel watching it?
Well, I can only talk about it from a personal point of view, but to me, it was important because it forced me to confront the story. Only if you I would always be very uncomfortable, genuinely taking any slaps in the back for doing this story, because for quite a number of years, I stayed away from it. I didn't ask the questions. I interviewed people who were at MTK, and I knew Daniel Kinahan was this guy behind it. I knew he had background that was interesting, to put it mildly, but I just stayed out of it. I just thought, this isn't a relevance to me. But that ban forced me to think about it more, read about it more, and confront it. And I just thought, this is a story that, you can't ignore. No, to me, it's the biggest story ever in Irish sport. I genuinely think that. A lot of people don't agree with that with me, but I think there's never been a figure in Irish sport who became so powerful in the global sport as Daniel Kinahan. And when you look at his background, it's a massive, massive story.
And he's a billionaire, so that shows something. But Kieran, let's be honest. When we're talking about this off air, you did, Donald McRae did. I think it's fair to say a lot of sports reporters didn't get involved.
No, but I genuinely, I don't blame them. I think everybody makes their own call. And you don't. I think just you're going to, like, I found this when I started writing on it. You're completely out of your comfort zone. Like I started out in 91, so you're saying like 25 years after that, I would never touch stories like this. So suddenly you're thrown into it. You're doing something very different for years. You're doing interviews that often would be quite soft. They're just kind of featurey interviews. You're doing match reports and covering various sporting events. You're covering there will be various scandals like what happens to the FEI and stuff, but you're not dealing with people who are responsible for people being killed. It is a very different world. And when you're not used to that or you've never done it before, and also, to me, it wasn't the case. No, I didn't go in. A lot of people go into sports journalism because they're massive sports fans. Like, obviously, have a huge interest in sport. They wouldn't be able to do it for so long. But that's why they've been drawn to it. Like, sport is the world to them. I wasn't that way. I fell into it completely by accident. I never thought I'd end up writing about sport. But I don't blame. Like, if people, but I can see why others might think it could be dangerous. What is to be gained from it? And also, they might think, I don't know how to cover this. I got no expertise. I don't have the sources, etc. So I'm not. I'd be reluctant to criticize others. The people I criticize more are the boxing specialists. That's something that is an important part of the story, actually. You look at, say, the Irish media. How many boxing reporters are left full time? I don't think there's any full time. There's a couple that it's their main area that they cover, but they do cover other things. And there was a time where in Ireland, the UK, America, etc., every media outlet had boxing cores, and might have been a couple of them. But all specialist cores have basically nearly all been dumped. Like, very few even golf and athletics cores now in Ireland or the UK. It's like soccer is and rugby to an extent in the UK as well. Like, soccer just is this monolith that sports coverage is often 80% soccer. So the people who do cover boxing here often, like with myself, it's 5% of what you do. So if you're suddenly confronting a story like this, you're going, I actually don't know this world that well. It's kind of tricky. But there are people who it is what they cover all the time, and they didn't ask the questions. And I would have an issue with those people.
Well, see, that's my point, Kieran. And I'm going to draw a parallel. Firstly, I think it's an important point. I'm not praising the Kinahans. I'm just being honest. I don't think the Kinahans would ever go after a journalist. In my opinion, I never had any, and I haven't exactly held back on the Kinahan cartel. I've never had any reason to fear any attacks by the Kinahan cartel. I just have to be honest. I don't know. Maybe Christy Kinahan Senior. Daniel's a hothead. Maybe Christy Kinahan Senior is too smart for that. That's my view. But you raised a fair point. Look, okay, maybe you were talking about some sports reporters not having the expertise, but they can open their mouth and they can ask questions. And you just said a lot of them didn't ask questions. And I don't think that's our finest art. And I'm going to give you a parallel. I'm a crime reporter, so the whole thing is about crime reporters don't mess up, don't do anything to annoy the guards, right? Now, I've done more stories about Garda corruption this year than any other journalist. And I have to say, and by the way, guards are delighted when I do it. They really are, because it's like, well, shaft him or shaft her, whatever. But I never got the sense that, people would stop talking to me. And I do have to say, whenever I do a story about Garda corruption or alleged Garda corruption, I feel a certain lightness in myself, because I'm going, right, I'm doing this and I'm confronting it. And I wonder, do you feel like that as well? Do you know what I'm saying? There's that sort of, is it relief that you're going after this rather than you're turning away and turning the other cheek like other reporters have done?
Well,
Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah. I'll answer it completely honestly, Mick. I don't think in terms of at all of what in terms of what other reporters are doing. I'm very glad that I took the story on, because I think it was worthwhile. Like, if I look back now, like, we're in a job that retirement could come very quick. The top of the shoulder comes once you go over 50. There's a fair chance of it happening, but or a lot younger, to be honest. But if I say 10 years ago, if I'd finished with journalism, look back on it and say, yeah, I went to a lot of World Cups and Olympics and all that, but I think I wouldn't have been that satisfied. I think I did something that's more worthwhile by taking this story on, because I think I just know I know my own background. I know the area that have been damaged by the Kinahan Hutch feud. I know about marginalised communities. I have family involved in boxing, and I hate what was done to the sport. So I just think any little bit at all that could help to highlight what that man did to boxing, is worthwhile. So if I'd ended up, taking, say, early retirement or redundancy, or just moving on to something a few years ago, before I ever touched that story, this story, I think I would have felt a bit dissatisfied. Like, I would have had the experience of going to Olympics and World Cups and covering major events and doing a lot of meeting a lot of interesting people, doing some interesting interviews with them, but I'd never got to teeth with a big story. Put my teeth into a big story. Where you see somebody like, say, Paul Kimmage, you would have had the Lance Armstrong story or the Michelle Smith story, or even from his own time as a cyclist. He exposed a lot of the doping that went on. And I think so. I think this was harder in the sense of hard news, and it was harder in the sense of it being tougher to cover and more challenging. And I think it was what I needed in my life and my career, to challenge myself that way, because it was completely out of my comfort zone. And there's often been times I thought, okay, I've done enough, I'll get out of it. Because you do, when you know yourself, when you're sticking with the story for over a couple of years, you get really sick of everybody involved. Like even I was thinking about this last night, Vic, about if I typed Daniel into my phone. Like a few years ago, predictive text might have given you Daniel Sturridge or even Daniel O'Donnell, but now you get Daniel Kinahan straight away. So just after a while, you get a bit weary of it. But I'm glad I've done it, because I think I do have a lot of affection for a lot of people within boxing and boxing people, and what it does for marginalised communities. And I hate what somebody like him has done to the sport.
And just last question, would you have, looking back, say if you hadn't touched it, like others have, would you have regretted that? Would it have been gnawing away at you, knowing you could have done something about it, but you didn't?
I genuinely don't know. I don't know if I wasn't in the position. I think I would have possibly had regrets that I'd never gone after a really big story. So, this is the obvious story to me, because I think it's too big to ignore. So I don't know. That's the thing. Would you have regrets if you hadn't gone after it? I don't know. But no, thankfully, the Fair News campaign and Sandra Vaughan's pushing it, and all these people pushing it, that made me force me to have a go at it.
And last question. Look, I know what it's been like. I can say I've been involved in writing about Kinahan since 2002, 2003. And, from a crime reporter perspective, it does take it out of you. It is hard. You have very bad days. It can be very stressful. Would it have been the same for you as a sports reporter trying to cover the sporting aspect of this?
Yeah.
Did it take a toll on you?
Yeah. Like, it's on your mind all the time, especially because, when they did the podcast series, that was a lot of work and a lot of interviews, and a lot of people say no. So, it's not just doing the interviews and then editing it and writing the script. You're getting people who will actually talk, and that's not easy in a story like this. And you need to do a podcast series. You need about 10 or 12, to make it worthwhile. You can't get it by 2 or 3 people. So, from that point of view, it's challenging. It is on your mind a lot, and you do feel often as if you're banging your head against a brick wall too. When you do, the abuse you get on social media, etc. over it. There's so many people in sport generally, but in boxing particularly, just want to enjoy the show. And if you rock the boat at all, they just, you're a target. Why are you ruining their fun? They don't like that.
Well, we're certainly glad you did. So the podcast is called Untouchable.
Yeah, it's called Untouchable. It'd be out from Tuesday to Friday, one episode each day. It's just in the build up to Katie Taylor fight. And I think, somebody's been well covered, but I think there is stuff in that podcast that people won't know, or there's interviews in there by people who've seen a side to her and who have an insight into but it's a very interesting story, I think.
I'm really looking forward to listening to the whole thing. I've had a sneak preview of one of the episodes when we discussed it about Daniel Kinahan. So I'm really, really looking forward to it, and I'd highly recommend it to our listeners. Kieran Cunningham, Chief Reporter with the Irish City Star, thanks for joining us today.
Okay, thanks, Mick. Cheers.